So our earlier speakers have been very helpful in setting out some of the background there. In this discussion, what we're hoping to do is to move on to look at what is happening in practice in various of the world's faiths and what further developments and indeed challenges we may see in the future. My team of panelists here today are exceptionally well placed to provide us with insights on these issues. I'm delighted Lorna has agreed to stay on to move into a commentating role from our partner organisation FaithInvest. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Eric Sukumaran, who prior to his present role at the University of Oxford's Said Business School was himself an investment banker. I hope I'm not giving away any secrets there, Eric. Then we have Geraldine Burnett from Gatehouse Bank. And finally, Azman Mokhtar on my left, who for many years was the managing director of Khazanah, the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia. So I'm conscious that our time this morning is limited, and I'm hoping we can spend as much of it as possible on looking at future opportunities for stimulating faith-based investment. But to get the ball rolling, perhaps I could ask each of you in turn briefly just to introduce yourself and give an indication of what your involvement has been in the world of faith finance. Lorna, would you like to start?
So I should probably say I'm not a banker. I'm not an asset holder. I work for
scoring points already.
I work for FaithInvest, and I also am the chair of the Laudato Si movement, which is a Catholic movement with the simple aim of bringing the vision of Pope Francis in Laudato Si on care for a common home to life. So there is let's say, a quiet revolution, I would say, happening within the Catholic Church at many different levels. And a big part of that involves thinking through what this message of Laudato Si, which calls on all of us to look at the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, to answer that cry, what that means in terms of our investments. The Catholic community as a whole makes up the largest subset of faith-based asset owners that have divested from fossil fuels. 307 Catholic institutions have divested. And there's a great thirst within those communities, those asset owners, to understand how do we reinvest our assets in solutions. And we can see that happening via impact investing collaboratives. The Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is working with religious orders in particular. The US IG, the Confederation of Religious Orders, now looking at how they shift their investments into ESG funds and into impact investing as well. On the horizon, we have a significant step change happening, hopefully in the next 6 months with the Catholic Church. The Church, the Vatican, together with Laudato Si movement and 200 partners, is announcing an action platform, global action platform on Laudato Si, which will include a significant element of training for faith-based, Catholic-based asset owners on how you connect your investments and the vision of Laudato Si. So we're looking at a very significant step change in the coming 6 months with this action platform.
Well, thanks very much. I'm sure there's lots more to talk about on that. Eric, over to you.
Thanks. Eric Sukumaran, hello. I'm here on behalf of the Oxford FaithAligned Impact Finance Project. So over the last 8 months or so, we have been doing some initial work into what is the map of faith capital around the world, or to the extent that that can be identified. We have tried to make it as pan-religious as possible, and also to what extent is that faith capital already deployed in impact creation. And so we're finding several things. First of all, there is a lot of faith capital, and I mean, Graham said many billions. The real answer is you can catalog trillions of dollars around the world in basically publicly identifiable assets, in funds, in sovereign wealth funds, and we're talking in terms of specifically identified impact creation money, you know, in the low single digits in terms of percentage of that total wealth. So that's one thing. The other thing that we are finding is that, and one of the reasons I used impact creation, impact finance versus impact investing, is that especially, but not exclusively, between the Abrahamic faiths and Dharmic faiths in particular, there's a very stark difference in the attitude towards intentionally creating impact. So on the one hand, we have, you know, here are religious rules, religious guidelines on how to invest your money and how you might create impact that way. But on the other hand, you have, for example, we were talking to a Jain organization recently who said, look, we are taught that an unlimited amount of anything is harmful and greed leads to violence. Philanthropy for us helps limit our wealth. It's one of the things that we must limit. So if we look to make any kind of return or profit out of the activity that we are doing to create impact, then we are contradicting our own faith principles. And so then philanthropy becomes a religious imperative around impact creation. So we are looking at both, okay, well, what is philanthropy doing in that space? And what is impact investing doing in that space? And what do those two areas have in common? How could they work together? What does it look like right now? And then we are also doing some very useful things like collating everything that we can find that exists and making it publicly available in one place, looking at what kind of training is available right now and what could be provided in the future. And we'll be, you know, presenting and publishing it all very soon. But so that's the kind of key takeaways. There's a lot of money. It does feel like, as you do the research, that we're on the verge of all of this increasing because of, for example, Islamic banks, of which we've catalogued assets in sort of $1.5 trillion alone, starting to, especially in Malaysia, but also in the GCC countries, starting to not only look at CSR, ESG, zakat as their way of creating impact, but also how are we embedding responsible, sustainable decision-making across our entire business. And so if I did this project in 5 years' time, I think there would be a marked difference. So it's a very exciting time to be cataloging it. And I hope to maybe do that again to sort of show how things, I think, are really about to improve in quite a big way.
Well, thanks very much. I think there's much more to hear about, I think, on that. And I think you make an interesting point about, in this sector, the way that impact investment and philanthropy shade into each other and the relationship of that within the whole faith finance world. Geraldine, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Geraldine. I'm here on behalf of Gatehouse Bank. We are a fully Sharia compliant British bank, and Sharia principles underpin our operations and our product offering. And we see a real natural alignment between the principles of Sharia and the UN SDGs. And in 2019, we became the first Islamic bank to be a founding signatory to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. So we are really looking at ways to demonstrate how our Sharia principles and our exclusion list and our screening of investments and the fact that we seek to balance and share risk and reward, the avoidance of high-risk financial transactions and the requirement that all of our investments are based on tangible assets, sort of mitigate some of the negative effects of those high-risk financial products, and really seeking to show how that aligns with the UN SDGs and illustrating that it's relevant, to international development and all the things that we do there. And we're also really focused on climate action. So I think traditionally Sharia compliance is really focused on the S and the ESG, but certainly from our side, although our screening does not currently involve the green for Sharia compliance, our internal Sharia team absolutely sees green action as completely aligned with Sharia compliance. So we started measuring our carbon footprint in 2020. We're now a carbon neutral organisation, and we are looking at our home finance portfolio now, and we're tracking the path to net zero there, setting climate targets in that space, and we see there's a real need and a role for Islamic banks to play in tackling climate change.
Thanks very much, and you're right to bring the focus to the SDGs, which is what we're here to mainly talk about. Azman, over to you. Eric's already touched on Malaysia, so perhaps you can pick that one up.
Yeah, thank you, Graham and Jeffy and everyone. First of all, I'm sorry I got a rather bad cough, and I should declare last night my wife and I tested negative, so nowadays you have to declare every time. I ran Khazanah, as what Graham introduced. Khazanah means treasure. Khazanah National means national treasure in about 12 languages around the world, including Malay, but also Arabic, Urdu, several African languages, and so on, right? So basically, we were the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia. Along the way, some people called us a sovereign development fund. In many ways, it reflected our own conception when I started back in 2004, a belief, a faith that the economy is a stakeholder economy and not just a shareholder economy. It was a bit lonely back in 2004 because you were kind of swimming against the tide and the strong wave of shareholder value, because 2004 was before the big 2008 global financial crisis of Lehman. So we started talking about building true value, and true value we define as, of course, financial value. We were investors of a commercial nature. We managed to more or less post a 10% per annum return, risk adjusted, which is, we think, pretty good. We basically trebled the portfolio in that period of 14 years. But a second conception was an economic value, which we tried to define what does this mean in terms of jobs, good jobs, in terms of access of opportunities, and so on and so forth, right? But it also meant the third conception of value was what we call societal value, which involves, for example, certain public or quasi-public goods like public education. How does a sovereign fund like us use blended finance, use sukuks, and so on to deliver that, right? Over the years, the tagline building true value, some clever people in my group started calling it, boss, you're trying to build true values as well. So you build true values. And indeed, this is at the heart of what we do. I retired about 3 years ago after a 14-year stint, which is a fairly long time in public or quasi-public office. Since then, I'm here today as a member of GEFI, but also as the chairman of the International Center for Education and Islamic Finance, which is a university that was established in Malaysia to further Islamic finance by our central bank 15 years ago. And I think it's fair to say, I suppose Malaysia's at, quite as Eric and others have mentioned, at the frontiers of what we try to push on Islamic finance, which, by the way, estimated assets is $2.5 trillion US, which may sound a lot, but I think there's some estimates, well, this number could go apparently, according to a GEFI report, to 3.8 trillion in 2022. That's enormous growth. But that 3.8 trillion, at last count, I think is still about 1% of global financial assets. Only 1%, or slightly under even. So I'm here today to learn, but also to share, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and particular thanks for all you've contributed to GEFI as well from your considerable and a really unique experience. I think now for the benefit of the audience, I think what I'd like to do is to try and look at the current scene in a little more detail, and perhaps we could just talk about some specific examples of faith-based investment in action in this territory. Lorna, from your work with Laudato Si, are there some ongoing projects that are up and running you could speak to us about, or give us an example of?
Yeah, I think the most relevant project to this discussion is the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative. So that was a small organisation, and again it comes back to this question of, well, in the Gospels Jesus talks about new wineskins. And are we at a point with the financial system and the investment world that we need to be creating the new wineskins in order to create the types of investments that we need to see? So the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is an organisation set up to bring together the religious orders to really to look at shifting the dial on impact investing. And there are some really powerful examples, such as the Cabrini sisters in the United States and the impact investing that they've been doing in relation to climate change. The Dominican sisters, who announced last year that they were moving significantly into supporting very grassroots climate justice work in the global south. And what we're finding is that, and working predominantly in like local rural-based renewable energy, there is an issue that's, I guess, coming up within the Catholic world. These funds are relatively small. In global finance terms, we're in low numbers of millions of dollars. The costs of setting these funds up is relatively high for the faith investors. And we are really facing a situation where we're looking at a world in terms of the faiths, the Catholic faith, that has been dominated by charity. There's a whole sector of Catholic charities that are grant-based and working with communities. And the big work that is going on within the Catholic community is to look at where it's relevant, where it has a significant impact, how you can bring an investment lens onto some of that grant-based work without undermining the work. And that's the real challenge, I think, in a sense of it can be very impactful. If you bring that investment lens, the work that the likes of the Franciscan Sisters of Mary have been doing in the United States has demonstrated in the area of social housing that you can scale, the scalability is significant when you bring an investment lens into rather than a charity lens. That's the biggest significant impact, that you can achieve much more with the same amount of capital. But it is slightly, I think there are many issues that need to be addressed through a dialogue, I feel, with the Catholic and the Christian charities, to look at how you work together to ensure that you don't land people really experiencing climate injustice in debt through the selection of the wrong partners, that this is something that really contributes to scaling up impact, especially in the global south.
Thanks. And that brings us back to the question of the interaction between investment and philanthropy that we touched on before, and the point you raised, Eric, about how different faith traditions view that. Maybe you could say a little about the specific examples that have come forward in the project that you're currently running, and that have some involvement as well with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll mention the sort of the Catholic-based case first, 'cause I think it sort of dovetails very nicely with what I was talking about. But on the point of the different orders of sisters in the US, we've picked up a lot of that as well in our research, and it's really extraordinary how it's done in as you're saying, small numbers and incredibly disaggregated. But we have this huge long list of them, and we found an example of actually them. Of some of them coming together and pooling their resources with the religious community investment fund, which does sort of these micro interventions both in sort of emerging markets and in the United States, and it's really extraordinary work. But sort of financial data is very hard to come by with them, and you know, at a next stage I'd love to be able to sort of investigate that more, because I think there really is a lot of scope there to set out examples of collaboration and scaling. You know, I think that's really, but yes, on that, on top of all the sort of different things that we find, we're also publishing sort of 3 more involved cases across different faiths. So one of them is focusing on the catalytic capital provided by Good Energies, who was a Catholic-inspired foundation operating under the sort of Porteous and Brenninkmeier umbrella. So they made an investment grant to Charm Impact, which is a startup that's come out of the University of Oxford. They make microloans in emerging markets to businesses that want to install solar energy to run their businesses, and that has 2 impacts. Number 1, obviously they don't have to use incredibly polluting generators. And secondly, it brings down their price of power incredibly from, you know, 35 cents a kilowatt hour to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Really, really transformational, and it allows them to expand. And it provides, thanks to the first loss capital that Good Energy has provided, it allows the interest rate at which these loans can be provided, and small loans, $10,000, $30,000, and they're scaling up the size of these loans. They can be offered at around 7.5 and 8%, as opposed to north of 25%, which is essentially not available credit. It's just what is available to them, and it's entirely impact focused. They want the money to be recycled. So there's a really great takeaway there, where the money that went into Charm is lent out, it's paid back, it's lent out again, and you have this kind of cyclical approach to lending as well that's being approached. But what this now does is it's catalytic. It has allowed Charm to increase the size of its lending, but also establish a track record showing that the risk models that external investors have been using aren't necessarily correct, right? Instead of pricing the risk at 25%, they're showing, you know, 99%, 98 to 99% debt repayments at 7%, at 8%. Now, there's still challenges on the scale, but we've got here sort of faith-aligned capital allowing a demonstration of a different way of approaching this. And so there's a very exciting next stage for them now. They've just, thanks to that, they've raised close to £500,000 of seed capital, and they're already going for Series A, and so that's very exciting and a very good outcome. So that's one sort of concrete example of how faith-aligned capital can show the way. Second one, completely different. We go back to Khazanah and the Izan Sukuk. So Sukuks are sort of Islamic bonds, and Khazanah had for some time been in financing out of its own revenue a program to transform schools in Malaysia. So schools in the public system that were perhaps using sort of kind of very, you know, outdated principles of teaching, you know, rote learning and a sort of different kind of school culture and parental involvement. They decided to issue a sukuk the proceeds for which went into stable 5-year funding in the for transformation of 40 schools, about $20 million altogether. And what makes the Sukuk different is, so you know, Sukuks aren't debt issuances. You have your periodic payments out of the profits generated in the investment, essentially, very simplified. But in this case, the returns to investors were essentially given out of Khazana's own investment income generation. And the terms of the Sukuk had key performance indicators for the schools. And if the schools met them, the principal that was given back to investors was cut by 6%. And that money could then be used again to reinvest in school transformation. The first Sukuk term has now ended. It was given out in 2 tranches. It was full take-up and very successful. The schools met their KPIs, and so now there's more money from the fact that the principal being paid back was reduced to investors, to invest in schools. So again, we have a kind of a cyclical approach to lending and finance. And the third one is completely different because it's philanthropic. And again, it's to highlight the philosophical differences around impact creation. So there's a family in India who decided to launch what's called a liberal arts university. So universities in the UK and in India are very subject specific. You go in and you study one subject for 3 or 4 years. Universities in America, you study loads of subjects until you concentrate on a major for your last couple of years. And that's not common in India at all, but this Jain family, which founded one of the biggest investment banks in India, decided to spend $100 million and found a university called Flame University. It now has 3,000 students and a campus. The impact focuses on scholarships for people who would not otherwise have been able to go to university, the impact on the local economy in Pune. And as I was saying before, the reason that it's philanthropy is because generating a return on it would be seen as immoral when they want to create impact. And so we've sort of discussed the religious foundations of both why they want to do liberal arts, the idea of looking at many different viewpoints, and while also understanding your own principles, and the fact that the university will be debt-free essentially forever, and they underpin that. So those are the sort of the big 3.
Well, that's super. That's given us a very broad range of the sort of thing that's going on, which is extremely helpful. I'm conscious of our time going on here. Geraldine, maybe could you just briefly give us an example?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick example of something that we're doing. I touched briefly on it before, which is aligning our home finance portfolio. Home finance is a Sharia-compliant mortgage portfolio with the Paris Climate Agreement. And to achieve that, we've taken estimates of the emissions of all of the homes in our portfolio, and then we're working with environmental consultants to sort of outline the path to take that portfolio from where it's at now, the baseline of emissions, to net zero alignment with the 1.5 degree warming by 2050. And I guess one of the really interesting things about this is they've created, we've worked together to create sort of different scenarios that might get us to net zero. And there are different levers that will help us achieve that. You've got the growth of the portfolio, we've got the activities that we can take as a bank, and then there's market forces, things like uptake of solar panels or air source heat pumps. And one of the key things there is, to create a more energy efficient portfolio of homes, we'll need to be able to support our customers to, say, maybe take extra finance to install solar panels on their roof or re-insulate, a bit, more efficient insulation for their homes. There's currently not a Sharia compliant mechanism to do so. So at Gatehouse Bank, we're working out how can we create not only align our home finance portfolio with the path to net zero, but then also create those mechanisms where we can support our customers to make their homes more energy efficient in a Sharia compliant way. And I think there's a lot of space there to develop equivalent to mainstream financial products that are Sharia compliant, and a real sort of commitment from our Sharia team internally at Gatehouse Bank.
Thanks very much. I might just hold off on a second if I could, because I think we've already had an example that really comes from your sector exactly, that Eric has perhaps slightly pitched from you there. So I'm conscious of time running out, and there's one gentleman here who's very keen to ask a question, so I think we should have that.
Thank you much, Graham. I'd like to give some oxygen to the word risk, which I think we heard just near the end of this. Pick up Lorna's point about dialogue and suggest one focus for that dialogue. I'm an evangelical Christian actuary who roams the world of finance doing stuff, and in the late 90s I helped an Islamic scholar set up a Sharia product for distribution through an Islamic bank, so I have a foot in a few camps. I think we investors are in the world of strategic risk management. I suggest faiths are in the game of strategic risk management through their own particular view of risk. I think you can see the SDGs through the lens of strategic risk management. So slightly challenging Lorna's public-private partnership. Don't just see it as money flows, think it as public-private risk sharing, and I think you get to a better place. Challenging one size does not fit all. Well, maybe, but if we think of risk as the one size fits all which bridges faith and finance, I just offer you strategic risk management as something we might want to think a bit more about. I'm very happy for any responses the panel have, and thank you.
Now, would anyone like to comment on that? Perhaps, Azman, would you have any thoughts?
I don't have much to argue. I think we should manage risk, but perhaps to add to that perspective, from the field I'm coming from, representing today, Islamic finance is actually very much about aligning risk and reward. The whole point why I believe what Omar mentioned around the prohibition of riba or money lending is you get a fixed return without the associated risk. That's a form of financial oppression. That's a form of financial oppression. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's two versions of the root word of risk. I believe one is Greek, because I researched this before, and the other is actually Arabic. The word comes from risky. Risky means provision, actually. There is no reward without risk. The issue is, of course, what kind of risk that you take. And as we know, in the field of investment or finance, it's about getting a fair return for the amount of risk that you take. The problem with the financial world today is the game is rigged, as we know. I think this is, I used to work in investment banks. In my defense as a head of research in investment research, but I'm afraid my children, our children, well, they make their choices, but I don't want them to enter the current form of finance. We do live in financial times. So certainly, strategic risk management is very much part of the equation.
Thanks very much. I'm very conscious we're nearly running out of time. Could we have kind of one sentence each? What I'd like to ask the panel is, what do they see as the biggest barriers, the biggest challenge for really mobilizing a greater amount of investment in the ESG world from the faiths? Do you want to pick that up?
I think the biggest challenge we face, well, there's two. I think the first is the challenge of joining the dots in a meaningful way between the principles and values that we've discussed this morning, Lord Wallace discussed so well before us, joining the dots between those and the crisis that we're facing today. A reverend on Monday evening at the Interfaith Vigil at the start of COP said something, I didn't catch his name, but he said something that struck me. He said, we need to start to live as if we believed that God created this world and it's worth saving. It really kind of grabbed me. I think you could substitute the word live with invest. And I think once we've done that, the biggest challenge we then face is the fact that we have institutions, faith institutions, that have effectively outsourced the management of their money and their investments to others who do not adhere, perhaps, maybe I'm getting into the kind of preaching side of things, but who we need to question whether those who are managing the money share those deepest values and how we can move to address that.
Eric?
Okay, so I also have two. So the first one I would say is perhaps sort of the official conclusion of the project research. And the second one is sort of my interpretation of it, both from sort of a finance background and the research itself. So the first one I would say is the lack of knowledge. We don't know what is happening within our structures, within different faith structures, and therefore we're not learning from each other enough or fast enough to be able to implement some solutions that are already sort of there. I would say that's probably sort of one big lesson, and the more there's dialogue like this, and the more that different principles can come together to see, well, what is it that we have in common? What can we actually agree on to work on? A lot of trust can be built from that. So that would essentially be one conclusion. And the other conclusion from that is, I think there are a lot of structural incentives that are not conducive to this happening quickly. Some of the big pension funds are saying outsourced money being managed, religious money being outsourced and managed, saying, we have a number, we're going to hit it, we need to hit it, and that's essentially that. And if your impact investment fits that model, maybe we'll do it. And that isn't the fault of the person telling me that. That is a structural incentive. And that's something that, and there are tax incentives too that can be changed. And that's something that we need to kind of fix within the global architecture of the financial system that would then allow a lot more of this to flow quickly.
Thanks. Yes, I think your point about the dialogue there is exactly what we were trying to get at in the setting up the Edinburgh Finance Declaration and the work that went on with that. Geraldine, just briefly, if you could.
Yeah, sure. I think a big piece is for us raising awareness and engagement with the Islamic banking community to really illustrate that what we do fundamentally is aligned with the UN SDGs and can include environmental considerations. So I think, for instance, only 3 fully Sharia compliant banks are signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. And I think, that really needs to change. And the more banks that join sort of international frameworks like that require quantitative impact measurement, setting targets, the more Islamic banks can really join sort of global movement and learn from peers and sort of follow a framework to really align themselves even further with the UN SDGs.
Thanks, yes, and that's work actually that GEFI's involved in to try and increase the number of Islamic banks in particular that are signed up. And then Azman, if you could
I was about to introduce, so I'll end with it instead. I think as my wife and I was driving up the M8 to this beautiful building here today, blaring on the radio was Madonna singing, "We live in a material world, and I'm a material girl." So I said, wow, this is quite profound. You know what, she's quite right. Of course, Madonna itself is kind of appropriated, maybe not very appropriately, since I'm coming to a faith gathering. So my conclusion and hope, I suppose, is how are we going to do from after Glasgow the path to sustainability in terms of both environment and society? There are 5 main levers, very briefly, Graham. One is market, so there's a lot of talk about carbon tax and carbon price. But markets need to be governed, so market governance, I'll just park that. Second is regulations itself, so some form of state governance, whether rules, regulations. Third, science and technology. We heard through the Scottish showcase, amazing stuff being done using technology, and I'm sure. But as we know, science, again, is quite agnostic. It really depends on, you can do it for good or bad. Fourth is finance. And finance, we are here in Glasgow. Adam Smith was the professor of moral philosophy, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Glasgow. So I said, we got to go back to Adam Smith, who locates the economy within the context of a moral economy. But I'm with my faith brethren and sisters here. We should go back further to Adam Smith, to Adam himself, our common forefather. Basically, and all in our tradition, the Islamic tradition, the seal of the prophets, including Jesus and Moses and so on, is Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Muhammad said, even if this is the last day and you have a sapling in your hand, plant that tree. Plant that tree. And Malaysia, we are thankfully actually 60% Muslims, not 100%, not 90%. So that means whatever ideas we put through on Islamic finance is a contested and a collaborated space actually with dharmic religions, Hindus and Buddhists and so on and so forth. And you have to find that middle path to put it all together. But finance also, at the heart of it, needs governance. And I'll end on basically how do we reclaim all of the above. It's about leadership. And we really need to put back morality, or indeed, if you want to call it ethics, back into governance. And the only governance or human governance that I know that really works is actually through faith. And for those of so-called non-faith, I think they're also faithful people in different ways, which I'm sure many of you will know better. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a super summary of a lot of the issues that we're here to talk about in a very brief time.